I'll be honest, I seem to have fallen into a category in my YouTube videos, and that is obscure aircraft. And that's fine. I have minimal interest in aircraft that have been thoroughly covered, unless there is some odd fact that I find interesting. So, with all that said and done, the Spitfire was literally the last possible aircraft I could think of doing a video on. I mean, how much has been said on the Spitfire? It's got to be in the running for most iconic aircraft in history. You had the Mark I and IIs that became legend fighting the Battle of Britain. The stalwart Mk.V. that provided the RAF's principal fighter through the dark early and mid-war years. The Mark IX, a testament to the soundness of the design and the bodging abilities of the British aero industry. And the Mk.XIV, the aircraft that shot down the V-1 flying bombs and helped finish the Luftwaffe as the liberation of Northwest Europe occurred. So when Matt at the Model Minutes channel asked me to do a collaboration and the subject would be a Spitfire, my first reaction was, meh. But then I looked at the actual type he was talking about and I thought it was pretty interesting. The Spitfire Mark VIII, an aircraft that by most standards would be considered a success, but by Spitfire standards is the black sheep cousin. And what is most remarkable is that the Mark VIII was an excellent aircraft. Supermarine's chief test pilot, Geoffrey Quill, so probably the best qualified person to hold an opinion on the subject, said that he considered the Mark VIII with standard wingtips to be the best of all the various marks of Spitfire from a flying point of view. In fact, this model had been intended to be the standard service fighter of the entire RAF, but was overtaken by circumstances. Despite the good performance of the early Spitfires during the Battle of Britain, the British understood that they were in a race to maintain fighter parity, or better, supremacy, over the Germans. They therefore began looking at making improvements to the design, particularly in streamlining. But the demands of the war meant that apart from some development work on the one and only Mark III Spitfire, little came of this, and emphasis was placed in getting the newer and more powerful versions of the Merlin engine into the existing airframes. This ultimately led to the Spitfire Mark V, the most prolific version, with 6,479 built. Pretty much just a Mark I or II Spitfire with a Merlin 45 engine, the Mark V provided sterling service from its introduction in early 1941. But the RAF still wanted a properly updated version of the Spitfire designed and into service, one which didn't just have a further upgraded engine, but also features that would further improve the type's performance. Work resumed on creating this next version of the Spitfire, now planned to use the Merlin 61 as its power plant. This featured a two-stage supercharger, which improved its performance at high altitude by around 50% as compared to the 45. Supermarine also planned several other improvements on what was to become the Mark VIII, meaning the new aircraft would be of stronger construction and have features such as retracting tailwheel, increased fuel load, and improved cruising abilities. With the war now taking place in theatres far from Northwest Europe, the Mark VIII would also be fitted with a Vaux air filter for the engine as standard. A wise idea as it would turn out. Design work continued through 1941, and it was expected that the new Spitfire would enter service in 1942 and allow the phasing out of the Mark Vs. Unfortunately, the Germans had also been developing a new fighter, and this sent a shockwave through Fighter Command when it first engaged RAF Spitfires over France in late 1941. The FW-190. This aircraft was demonstrably superior to the Mark V, and led to a crisis in November after the new German fighters tore up the Spitfire escort of a bombing raid on Lille. RAF operations over France had to be suspended until a counter could be developed, and this is what resigned the Mark VIII to becoming a fringe model of Spitfire, comparatively speaking. Deploying the same methodology as had created the Mark V, Supermarine hastily developed the Mark IX Spitfire. This once again used the old fuselage, a slightly modified Mark V-C, and bolted in the Merlin 61 that was intended for the Mark VIII. First flying on February 26, 1942, the Mark 9 was a great success, and because production could largely be done on the existing factory lines with minimal disruption, the type was in full production by June 1942 and entered service the following month. Although it had been intended as a stopgap measure, the Mark 9 became the next generation of Spitfire, and the Mark 8 was largely surplus to requirements. However, because the aircraft had been designed with the thought that the RAF and Allies would need to fight in hot and dusty climates, the Mark 8 actually found a niche as an overseas fighter in some of the distant campaigns of the Second World War. And here, it would really show just how capable a fighter it was. 3 major versions of the Spitfire 8 were built. The F model, using the Merlin 61, was the standard fighter variant. There was also the LF for low and medium altitude combat, which was the most produced version and used the Merlin 66, and the HF high altitude fighter, which used the Merlin 70. All of these engines produced over 1,700 horsepower, though at different altitudes, and the Mark 8's top speed was rated at between 404 and 416 miles per hour, again depending on the type and the altitude. Armament was fitted in the universal wing, which had been adopted on the Mark 5, and allowed the carriage of either 4 20mm cannon or 2 cannon and 4 303 Browning machine guns. The Mark 8 was able to carry an external bomb load of a single 500-pound bomb on the centerline and a single 250-pound bomb under each wing, for a total load of 1,000 pounds. Drop tanks of various sizes could be carried, giving a maximum possible range of 1,500 miles. The new features of the Mark 8 also set the standard for following models of the Spitfire, with one aircraft, JF299, being used to test a new cut-down rear fuselage and teardrop canopy that would become standard on later Marks. Unfortunately, because of the panic to get the Mark 9 into service to deal with the FW190s in Europe, fielding the Mark 8s was slow to begin with. Although the first production model was completed in November 1942, it took until June 1943 for the first squadron to be equipped with the Mark 8, almost a year after the Mark 9. Deployed to the Mediterranean initially, the Mark 8s saw use during the invasion of Sicily and the subsequent campaigns in Italy and southern France. It is here that the model Matt has made is of particular interest, a Mark 8 that was used by the American 308th Fighter Squadron in Sicily and Italy. I talk about the type's service with the USAAF on Matt's video, so check out the link in the description if you want to know more about that subject. But suffice to say, this Spitfire Mark 8 was lethal, a substantial improvement on the Mark 5s that had been holding the line, and which were starting to be outclassed by not just better German fighters, but Italian ones too. The Mark 8 was up to the challenge, and the type would fight throughout the rest of the war in southern Europe and proved an excellent fighter aircraft. But it was in the Far East where the aircraft would really make its mark, beginning to equip squadrons in eastern India towards the end of 1943. This proved extremely fortunate timing, as in March 1944, the Japanese launched their attack aimed at destroying the Indian and British armies in the country and opening a route for a full invasion. Key to the British counter-strategy was the ability to supply units cut off by the Japanese by air to keep them in the fight. Naturally, air superiority was a key factor, and the Spitfire Mark 8 was the perfect aircraft for the job. The Mark 5 Spitfire had been a fair match for the primary Japanese army fighters in the theatre, the Nakajima's Ki-43 Oscar and Ki-44 Tojo, but with few real advantages over them. As a result, Indian, British and Commonwealth pilots had gone through a similar process as the US Navy had in learning specific tactics to get the best from their aircraft when it came to fighting the Japanese. Just as the Americans found their methods became much more effective when they transitioned from the F-4 Wildcat to the more powerful F-6 Hellcat, the Spitfire pilots found that with their new aircraft they were able to sweep the skies. As a result, the Mark 8 played a role in allowing the Allies to keep their units supplied by air, grinding down and eventually crushing the Japanese offensive by August, and beginning their own offensives into Burma. The Mark 8 would also prove a boon to the Royal Australian Air Force in defending Northern Australia and in the hard fighting in the Southwest Pacific. Since February 1942, cities and towns in Northern Australia had been subjected to periodic attacks by Japanese Army and Navy bombers, often escorted by the fearsome Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighter. The Spitfire Mark 5 had become the main fighter defender of the RAAF against these, and again the Australians had learnt, like Allied pilots flying other types, that you had to be careful to fight with the right tactics against the Zero. Expensive lessons paid for in aircraft and pilots. These lessons would pay off when the conversion of squadrons to the Mark 8 began in April 1944. Though by this point the Japanese attacks on Australia had ceased, the RAAF's Mark 8s were initially assigned to the defence of Darwin, and then soon found themselves deployed to the Dutch East Indies. Here the lack of opposition soon saw them used as ground attack aircraft. Despite the development of later model Spitfires equipped with the Griffon engine and other newer fighters, the Mark 8s stayed a viable frontline fighter against opponents across the globe right up until the end of the war. Yet despite this, they don't seem to get the same sort of attention as their fellow Spits, probably because it fought mainly in the theatres that were monikered the Forgotten Wars by the soldiers who campaigned in them. And that isn't fair, either to the aircraft nor to the participants, who both deserve recognition for the contribution they made. In reality, the Mark 8 was the third most produced model of Spitfire, with a total of 1,658 built. Hardly insignificant. But compared to the Mark 5's nearly 6,500 and the Mark 9's more than 4,000 aircraft built, it is a comparatively small number. Which is ironic, because but for the appearance of the FW190 and the subsequent rapid and highly successful development of the Mark 9, the Mark 8 would likely have been built in vast numbers as the standard British fighter aircraft from 1942 until early 1945. So I think it is fair to say that the Spitfire Mark 8 is, paradoxically, probably the most successful might have been aircraft to have existed.